Welcome back, Camden Catholic. So we're going to pick up today with this flip where we left off in class for most of you today. And we were going really in depth with Mesopotamia and how they affected us as a current day society. We talked about cities, food surpluses, social structure, religion, government, writing. We haven't really got in depth with the writing yet. And we kind of stopped right about here with the Sumerians, right? So that's about 4,000 BC. So 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right? In what is now, write this down, present day, anybody want to take a guess? It's okay. You're not necessarily going to know it, though. It's Iraq, okay? In present day Iraq is where Sumeria, Mesopotamia, all of these large civilizations existed. Now remember, Mesopotamia is an umbrella term for a lot of the societies and the empires that existed underneath it. You had the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, so we'll talk about all of them as time goes, though. So, the Sumerians' biggest contribution, though, of course, if you ask me, was irrigation. Now, irrigation is a system of dikes, ditches, and dams to move water from one place to another. However, they also came up with a really new political and social organization where they created these things called city-states. Now, I know in my first period I was talking about how my 5th grade teacher beat this term out of us, right? By this point in history, countries did not exist. Countries didn't even actually pop up until the 1700s, like early 1600s, that era, 16 to 1700s. That's when borders began to be drawn, principalities began to show up, nation-states, kingdoms, etc., right? So city-state was when one city, each city had an autonomous government, right? Each city had a government that was completely working on its own, and then occasionally an empire would grow, and then those city-states would pay tribute back to the leader of the empire. But we'll talk more about that specifically as time goes. So, city-state is when a city acts on its own government. It has kings, priests, slaves, all of those things, right? Commoners, artisans, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so let's keep going though. So right there is one of the original Sumerian. That is the original city-state of Sumeria. As you can see, large architecture, very basic though. Lots of much more brick and mortar than metal and steel. All right, because steel and metalworking hasn't even actually come up yet. Okay, so it's really, really important that we understand that. So let's keep going though. Bam, culture and religion. Mesopotamia was the very first society that also created its own culture and also its own religious system. All right, so cuneiform was actually the writing that they came up with, and we have. All right, so we have no idea how to translate cuneiform to this day. We think we know some of it, but that's about all we have because nobody speaks Sumerian anymore. All right, so the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually the very, very first story ever written in this language. So, also they came up with astronomy, numeric system, right? The idea of counting by numbers. They actually counted in like bundles of wheat, but we'll talk about that later on as well. Ziggurats, write that word down, ziggurats, the very first monumental large-scale buildings, all right? And they were actually temples, right? And the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians believed the bigger the ziggurat, the closer to God, the easier he can hear us, right? Funny enough, there are over 3,000 gods in the Sumerian culture, right? And then also, the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians were documented with a big ziggurat in the Bible. Any of our really good Catholic school kids know the answer to that, or our Sunday school kids know the answer? What was that tower called? Anybody? Boom! I heard you over there, Liam Barnett. The Tower of Babel, right? Tower of Babel was the big one. They also came up with the wheel and the plow. So, that right there is an original ziggurat. So, and this is what cuneiform looks like. Like I said, we don't actually understand what it says 100%, and it's also a very rudimentary language in the fact that it doesn't have any filler words like or like or you know or anything like that. So, it's a very basic language that we still to this day cannot decipher. We don't even know if it goes left to right, right to left. It could go up and down as well. But we know that they were the first ones to come up with a system of writing. And they actually did it by slapping down pieces of clay and using a stylus to etch the images into the clay. So, the Babylonians are going to come up after the Sumerians, and they're going to conquer the entire Fertile Crescent, right? And they're also still in Mesopotamia, though. You see, that's what I'm talking about. Mesopotamia is a big word for Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, all these other peoples, right? So they were led by a very famous emperor, though, and his name was Hammurabi. Hammurabi is going to create the very first codified law. And that law was based off one principle, an eye for an eye, all right? So hypothetically, if I went up to Dante and punched him in the head, he technically gets to punch me back. That's eye for an eye, right? One thing for another. The only time it was a little uneven is if Dante was really wealthy, and I would say, why don't you pay me for my suffering, and then we'll call it evens. So anyway, but let's keep going. So as you can see, this is how the Mesopotamian government and how the Sumerian government, the Babylonian government, all these things were set up. Now, this is spread out all over the place. Tons of individual city-states that govern each other and themselves and then report back to the lead city-state of the empire, right? So, as you can see, Kutha and Larak and Babylon and Larsa and Ur, all these city-states govern themselves, but they were a part of what is Mesopotamia, right? So, Now, they are majorly different from one other big empire that popped up right near their era as well. And they were known as what? Exactly right. The ancient Egyptians, right? Based around the Nile River. So, this civilization is going to emerge about 3200 BC. So, the Egyptians were right on the tails of the Sumerians by about 800 years. Now, here's the coolest thing about the Egyptians, though. They didn't have any city-states whatsoever. They were one centralized kingdom that was ruled from the capital city, okay? So, and that's in Cairo. Now, also, their government was called a theocracy, where they believed that their pharaoh was a part of God, okay? So, this right here, this word though, bureaucracy, very important. The Egyptians also developed a bureaucratic system of government, which is the fact that the pharaoh then chooses assistants or people beneath him to carry out jobs. So those, like, for example, the pharaoh wasn't knocking door to door collecting tax money. Of course not, right? He had someone do it for him. That's a part of a bureaucratic system. Another way to look at a bureaucratic system, of course, is like at school, right? It goes from Miss Whipkey as the president, to Miss Creasy as the principal, to our other vice principals, then to the teachers, then to the parents, and then down to the students. Sorry, but you guys are kind of at the bottom of this bureaucracy. So, anyway, they also came up with a hieroglyphic alphabet, okay? So, hieroglyphics is actually different from cuneiform because they're pictograms, right? Pictogram is like trying to communicate using a picture. You use pictograms all the time, except you call them emojis, okay? So, papyrus is also going to be created. It's the very first paper using river reeds to press them together into these large pieces of red paper. And they also had a very complex religion. They were polytheistic, They were polytheistic, which means they believe in lots of gods. So right next to polytheistic, right, believes in many gods. And they also believed in an afterlife. We'll talk more about that when we get into the really cool stuff like mummification. But their afterlife was actually really funny because they believed that there was a river where on the other side of it was heaven, but it was actually called the happy field of food. And there was no hell in the Egyptian religion. You actually were eaten by Osiris's crocodile called the Death Eater. But we'll talk about that stuff tomorrow. So, anyway. As you can see, these are pictograms over here to your right, and that's the hieroglyphic writing. And they also had large-scale religious architecture, known by most commonly as the pyramids, right? So, major differences, we're going to stop here, but this is the last thing I'll talk to you about. Major differences between the two main first empires and the largest ones that existed other than Persia were the city-states first centralized government. Mesopotamia was a city of city-states spread out all over the place, and Egypt was centralized and ruled from one specific spot. There was also a larger amount of trade in Mesopotamia. There was greater technology in Mesopotamia as well. However, women had a higher status in Egypt. This is why I'm a big Egypt fan, right? Actually, the very first female ruler of an empire was in Egypt, and her name was Hatshepsut. Anybody know who her grandson was? Anybody? Over there? Yeah? You got it, Liam. That's right, Mr. McDonald. King Tutankhamun was her grandson. So, Another thing is they were polytheistic. We talked about that. But similarities, also very important. They both had systems of writing, even though they were very different. However, the Sumerians did come up with it first. They both had systems of math. All right, and they also had a stratified government, which had many levels, right? And of course, the Egyptians, though, they used a bureaucratic or a bureaucracy. So these things are all very, very important, these differences and similarities. We're going to expand on this stuff a little bit tomorrow and why these empires are really, really important. But remember, in this class, we move fast, so we ain't going to be here long, okay? So I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Have a good evening, Camden Catholic.